The Chancellor is in a bind. He's promised the public that he will have debt falling as a proportion of GDP within the next 5 years. That means keeping a tight rein over tax and spending. But there's also a general election looming, and he'll want to find space in the budget for some giveaways to tempt voters. So how much room does he actually have to play with? Well, back in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted he would meet the target of getting debt falling as a proportion of GDP with £6.5 billion worth of headroom. And so far, things have panned out better than expected, largely because high inflation is actually boosting tax revenues. So far, then, in the year to date, the government has beaten the OBR forecast by £11.3 billion. It means the headroom is still intact. But it's too early for the Chancellor to start plotting big spending pledges or tax cuts just yet. That's because although the borrowing figures have come in better than expected, the outlook for the economy has darkened. And remember, the Chancellor's target is to get debt falling as a proportion of GDP. So if economic growth slows, that gives him less space to borrow. It will also reduce the government's income from tax receipts. And back in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility was penciling in growth of 0.2% this year and 2.1% next year. Since then, however, economists have actually downgraded our economic prospects. That will weigh on the headroom, as will the rising cost of servicing government debt, which is eating into the Chancellor's budget. As the Bank of England continues to raise interest rates, the return that investors are demanding on their loans to the government has climbed considerably higher than it was in March. The yield on 10-year gilts has even surpassed the level it was back in the aftermath of the mini-budget last September. And if we're paying more to service our debt, that leaves less money to spend on things like public sector pay deals, investment and tax cuts. So if the Chancellor wants to get debt falling as a proportion of GDP, his room for manoeuvre is actually limited.